Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning into another Supatease video. And you can't go anywhere on World of Warcraft YouTube at this point without seeing content creators talking about World of Warcraft in decline. What is retail doing wrong? These other games are all so vastly superior. And what can World of Warcraft really do about it at this point? And in today's video, I've basically identified 4 major barriers that are likely limiting World of Warcraft's success. And I wanted to talk about them, the pros of them and the cons of them. There's basically only one barrier that is pretty much only cons, whereas other barriers have pros and cons that I think definitely need some debate and discussion. So let me know what you think about my thoughts here on these barriers in the comments down below, because I'm sure that it is going to be very widespread as far as opinion in that regard. So the first barrier that I kind of want to talk about here, this is kind of like gear / time. This is something that a lot of players will be like, it's an MMORPG, right? It's all about grinding gear. It's all about progressing your character. And there are a lot of players who want to do that, right? But then there's a lot of other players who just would rather do the content. They'd rather just run the Mythic Plus keystones and try and time them as fast as possible, or they'd rather do PvP and feel like they're on an even playing field against their opponents and not have to deal with any sort of burden on time and grinding for gear. And this is something that they've found, like, I think a decent middle ground, where you do farm, like in PvP, for example, you do farm gear with conquest, you progress your character, and then at a certain point, they let the floodgates open. You can just get conquest rapidly and then really do whatever you want with your character. So you get that initial gearing experience, and then you get the freedom a little bit late into the season. And I think that it has been reasonable in that regard. I think that system has been a nice kind of middle ground, but unfortunately there are some players who probably still find it too cumbersome in order to gear up their character. And honestly, I think the complexity of the systems when it comes to gearing is probably more of an issue now than it is the system itself. I think, gear up for a few weeks, then uncapped conquest is great, but then figuring out how the crafted system works, figuring out how your crests work, figuring out on quests that you get weekly that might award you tokens that give you free other slots of gear that come from different vendors in different zones that are separated for PvE and PvP and Ashkahet. I feel like you get overloaded with the amount of different places you need to know exist in the game, where you need to go get them, how are you going to make them. I think the complexities of the gear is probably the biggest issue of this barrier whenever you're a new player that's coming into the game at this point in time, more so than pretty much anything else. And I've seen some players in Mythic Plus as well complaining about the crest systems and how they want it kind of like uncapped, and they want their gearing system a little bit more similarly to PvP, I think, at this point. So maybe that is something they should adopt for Mythic Plus, which is, you gear up your character at the beginning, but at a certain point, you're kind of bored of playing that character. You want to play some alts, but there's a lot of friction in terms of getting over onto alts. And that friction for alts is also going to be felt as friction for players who are starting at that period of time trying to get into the game. So it's possible that PvE can likely learn something from the PvP gearing system and maybe adopt some of those strategies in order to make it feel a bit better in that regard. But this is a barrier that I feel like in the genre of an MMORPG, we've only at one point, at least in PvP, seen it kind of removed, and that was in Legion. And for a lot of players who wanted that, they really liked it. But then for other players, obviously something was lost, and they decided to go back with gearing. So obviously, this is a barrier that needs to be there. I think for this barrier, it's about reducing complexity, making it simpler to gear up your character, and then making certain periods in a season easier to catch up alts, or periods in a certain patch to gear up your alts, and for new players to come back into the game. Those are the two main things I think with this barrier that could help in terms of retaining and getting players in at any point in time. The next main barrier that I want to talk about here is kind of like skill. And it's weird to think of this as a barrier, but I feel like a lot of people, I see them list this as a barrier. They'll say, like, people don't play World of Warcraft because it's just too much. You got to learn so much, and it's all this, and I'm not too. That's why nobody's playing it. As if making a game that's really simple and easy is just going to automatically attract players and retain them for a long time. That's why I feel like it's a bit of a hollow argument. And we've seen other games that tried to take that approach where we'll just simplify the game and it'll automatically be a big success. And it has not worked out that way. It's deceiving, right? I think it's one of the Blizzard's motto where it's like easy to pick up, but difficult to master type of deal. It's lightning in a bottle. It's not that simple. You can't just, this game is really easy, so it's going to be successful, right? The same way that arbitrarily saying a game is really complex complex is going to be really successful. No, that's not really how it works. So as far as it comes to skill in the game, when I'm talking about class design, in the game, I definitely think this is when we move into like ability count. Some specializations I think are still a little bit too overbloated. I think something like a shaman, especially something like a resto shaman, is got way too many abilities, way too many skills. So finding the sweet spot for that, because I think one advantage also of World of Warcraft that I really like is that some specializations are very simple and other specializations are erring more on the complex side. So you have a range of specializations that you can go for. So I think with this, making sure that there's a play style available to every level of complexity, right? So you have an easy AoE spec, you have an easy single target spec, you have an easy 2-target cleave spec, and then on the opposite end, you have a more complicated 2-target cleave spec, a more complicated AoE spec. So as a player, you can go into the game and kind of go for whatever level of difficulty and whatever playstyle you want, and to make sure that your playstyle is represented at the level of difficulty that you really want to undertake, could be a way to do this. But to be fair, I feel like they have done a very good job of doing that anyways, as far as separating the skill levels between the specializations. I think the problem with skill comes into add-ons. I think that's kind of been like, that's been, I think, a more fair argument, because you have to go external to the game in order to download these settings, and then you have to watch videos on how to set them up, and it's this extra layer, extra step, right? I mean, imagine if you downloaded Overwatch and then you had to go onto a website, download a third-party thing that gave you an extra cooldown tracker or an extra, whatever. It's just like, at a certain point, it's like, it's too cumbersome on the player to need to be able to do that. So I think updating the baseline UI, giving more meaningful impact information, is definitely needed. That's something that would 100% help with that. And then instead of kind of just like hiding all the information from players, create a UI tutorial that teaches players when they log in. Like if they join a Mythic Plus, hey, you can track your allies' cooldowns on this part of the screen, and you can track enemy cast bars and interrupts here. And these skills that have been highlighted can be used to stop enemy cast bars, and just like some baseline in-game level tutorial stuff. So when you're looking at your character, you're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And another thing too for skill is just simply setting up a keybind. So when you make a new character and you level up from level 1, you get a new ability, it starts highlighting and it's like drag it onto your bar, but the game doesn't actually teach you how to even make a key binding. And while these are things that we take for granted as experienced players, I can remember when I was playing the game as a noob, I didn't know how to make one, and I played the game with no key binds. I just dragged things down and clicked them. I came from RuneScape. I thought that's just what you do. That's just how you play the game. So I feel like having these type of tutorial level UI setups, a better baseline UI, would definitely enhance the experience and lower kind of like the intimidation factor, I think, when it comes to skill. But like I said, with these barriers, there's pros and cons, because if you overly simplify the classes and you reduce the skill too much, players are going to get bored really fast and they're probably going to leave. But if you leave it on the edge of it's way too high and it's way too hard to get into, then they're intimidated and then they don't even try. So this is a really difficult balancing act. But the simplest ones, the most constructive ones I can think of, is just updating the baseline UI so that add-ons are less required. I don't know if it'll ever get to the point where they will actually ban add-ons, because there are some add-ons that help enable with accessibility. I know there's some players who are blind and they play and they use add-ons with audio cues, and there's a lot of like disability oriented add-ons that help increase accessibility for players. Although I feel like there's got to be a way to enable those add-ons and not other ones that completely like change the way that you're looking at the game. I see some people come to my chat on my stream and like, I really like your UI because it's just simple and you don't have a lot of stuff that's going on that just feels like it's way over the top. So something in there to try and reduce it. But it's one of those things where if you reduce the ability count, I'm really worried that people are just going to get bored. I don't think that a game inherently being simple is inherently going to be successful. So this is a dangerous barrier. But again, we've talked about the pros, we talked about the cons with that. The next barrier is social. And again, none of these barriers, I just spelled social wrong. None of these barriers have only pros. So for social, downsides for this, you got to spend time meeting people, organizing them, and regularly getting them to show up to whatever the content is that you got to do into the game. Right. And you got to maintain relationships with them. That's, there's downsides to that, but there's upsides to that. You got a connection with somebody. and it doesn't feel as socially isolating, right? So I think World of Warcraft in the past, like that's been like the big main selling point. You're in a guild, it's like your second family, and all this other stuff. So as we kind of skew towards solo queue, we skew more towards delves, and we skew more towards possibly Mythic Plus with a solo queue button, you're going to be more socially isolated. And that can come with potential risks. We don't know what happens in World of Warcraft if it ever becomes entirely socially isolating, where no players are really directly interacting with each other, and basically everyone else with them could be AI running around in whatever content it is that they're doing. We don't know if that would actually cause damage or not, because it does seem like a benefit, right? I've seen a lot of suggestions like Mythic Plus, it should have you just queue up. And because the benefits are that you can get past LFG in the gatekeeping, whether it's based on your skill or it's based on your spec, you can get completely around that with a solo queue button. That is the pro. But the con is it's probably going to feel pretty isolating at a certain point, I would imagine, into the future. So pros and cons with this one. It's a tough one because I think that it has benefited PvP. I think in a lot of cases probably has saved participation for PvP. Again, it's because of the gatekeeping in LFG. Now you can just do solo queue, and I've seen a lot of teams form from solo queue. So this is where it's like the solo content should be used as a way to train yourself and get some gear so your character is relevant. So it's used to develop your skill and develop your gear, so that you can then find players that have also gone through that process to then join together for the group content. To me, that's how I would envision the solo content in the game. It should never just be you can just only do delves and then you get everything in the game, because then you'll never interact with anybody else. I see that path of least resistance for humans. You'll just never interact with anybody else, and I worry that would be really damaging moving into the future. So for like something like Mythic Plus, making it so maybe Keystones level 1 to 5 you can queue up for, so you can get your foot in the door, see what the dungeons do with Keystone levels, and get your character a little bit more gear, so then you can get into LFG and have a better footing for like an initial starting point with other players, and they're not so far ahead as far as gear and skill that they just feel like you're useless to them and they can't use you, and that's why they're kind of just ignoring you and not inviting you, and you can kind of develop those abilities. Again, these all come with pros, they all come with cons, and balancing the line between the two of them is like the big thing to do with it. But those are my ideas on it. Again, let me know what your thoughts are so far on this discussion in the comments down below. And the final one that pretty much has almost no downside, at least for the player base, is financial. So a financial barrier. Now, back in 2004, back in 2007, like World of Warcraft, it was it. This was the game to be, right? Like it's got a sub cost. You got to pay for a box fee. Then they introduced some microtransactions into it, and it's got basically every single financial angle on it possible to monetize it. But we're seeing every other big game go in the opposite direction. With most recently Path of Exile 2 and Marvel Rivals just completely exploding with basically no pay to win options for monetary reasons, only cosmetics, and being free to play. We're seeing that their queue times are instant. We're seeing that it's an explosive amount of participation in all of their games, and that's kind of what will aid with barriers like time, with the queue times and things like that, is if we can somehow reduce that. Now, obviously, that comes at a huge risk and a huge cost to Blizzard, and if Blizzard is just printing bank and making money with the current systems that they have, then why would you want to take the risk? And there's also the social aspect of like, oh my god, WoW went free to play, KEKW, this game is dead. There's this annoying like narrative level that needs to be considered with this. But if it was going to like completely explode in popularity, I feel like a free to play model is the only way you're ever going to get like a new audience into the game. Because if you're just a new player growing up, justifying in the current economy, like, hey, mom, I want to subscribe to WoW. I need $15. Oh, $80 for the games too. And I need to buy a WoW token because I'm trying to catch up, play with my friends. And it's like, you're already $150 down the drain just to get in the door. Yeah, that's a massive barrier. That's going to be a huge barrier as far as like, getting people in the door, but also keeping them, because it's like an ongoing thing. So this is something that's on Blizzard's side, where it's like, they would have to figure out how to make it work. And how to dance around the narrative of going free to play, so it doesn't make it feel like the game is dying. Because I do think this of all things is actually the main thing preventing new players from getting into the door of any sort of significant volume, with a little bit of this that I think can definitely be tweaked. It can definitely be improved. And then if all of these 4 barriers with the pros were amplified from them, and the cons were limited as much as possible, I could see like World of Warcraft easily, exploding again. As far as popularity. So I just wanted to list this out. These are kind of some of the thoughts that I had. Let me know with the comments down below. What are your thoughts on this? Am I totally off base with this? Again, I think it is important that gear matters and that you have stats, but it's kind of a balance of like how much time does it take and at what point can you get catch up gear on it. Skill, I think, again, if you lower it too far, people are going to get bored and leave. If you leave it too high, then people just feel like it's unapproachable. I think UI, that's like the main focus point that needs to be looked at and improved. Social, I think solo queue systems are inevitable. Like we need some level of solo play, especially with an aging population. But I really prefer it to be the means to develop your character's gear and ability so that then you can jump into content with groups without it being as wide of a gap. And then the financial one, which will probably never happen, even though it is easily the biggest barrier to getting new players into the game, reducing queue times, etc. Massive improvement would be on their side in terms of finding a monetization structure that can actually make the same amount and ideally more money while also getting the benefits of not having that barrier. So thank you guys for tuning in and watching. Hope you guys enjoyed the discussion. If you want to make sure you're staying up to date with news related to World of Warcraft, educational and entertaining content, then smash the subscribe button. Your support is greatly appreciated.